All right, let's get this started. So, welcome. My name is Nick Frost. So, I'm doing this because right now, in the time of COVID, it's very hard to talk about grief. It's hard to deal with grief. It's hard to even really talk about what's going on without being political. So, if we end up being political, so be it, but that's not our point. Tonight, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to deal with grief, about why grief is important, because the thing is that we are only given a few days in modern society. I believe there's 3 days of what we call bereavement leave after someone dies, to just sort of get over it. And of course, we know that there's a lot more to it than this. But as a result, we really do not spend a whole lot of time letting ourselves process this grief. Now, we're going to be doing a few things here. We're going to be talking about why feeling that grief is important. We're going to be actually spending a little bit of time defining grief. We're going to define grief. We're going to define bereavement. We're going to talk about the purpose of grief. There is a whole reason why it exists. You should let yourself go through it. In fact, if you don't let yourself go through it, it ends up being a bit unhealthy and be a thing that kind of bites you later on. Uh, Now, we're also going to talk a little bit about the process of grief. Now, the thing is, grief has a different process for everyone, but we will talk about what is referred to as, the sort of typical or normal grief process. One that can be considered the sort of healthy process in many ways, so the healthiest version of the process that we know of. So that's just a little bit of what we'll be doing here. So thanks for hanging in. I've got a few notes here on my phone, a few more in a little notebook that I have here. But let's get started. All right. So now the first thing. Let's go ahead and switch this over. I like this little graphic here. Ghost hug. You can't feel it, but it's there. And that sort of represents a few things here. It represents, of course, the hugs from the ghosts in our lives. Those who we've lost. May not have been recently to COVID-19. It might be from something a little bit more further in the past. I know for me that's largely what's going on now. I've lost one friend during this epidemic, but and of course it also refers to the fact that we can't be around each other as much as we would like to, and that to support each other, this is what we have. We've got kind of the time that we can give each other that little bit of a ghost hug. All right, so I'm going to pop myself in here. All right. So, all right. Let me get my notes. Now, I said I was going to talk about a few things about grief here. I said I was going to talk about, as I said, I was going to start by defining grief, because there's a few different words that we use when we're talking about grief, and having them, properly, shall we say, well, just having a proper definition of them can be helpful. Okay, so now let's go through a few. Well, first I want to describe grief, and this is not a definition, but this is a description of grief that I thought was poetic, but also something that was easier to understand. Okay, and that is, grief is the shape that love takes when someone that we love dies. Now, that to me is incredibly important, because it says that we're experiencing this grief not not out of selfishness. We're feeling it for more than those 3 days, because they were important, and we need to feel that. um so but let's go over kind of some clinical-ish definitions of them. So grief is the distress caused by bereavement. Okay, now the distress caused by being deprived of someone. That's what bereavement is. Bereavement is being deprived of someone, in some cases, something. You can bereave your loss of anything from freedom in many cases. That's certainly a type of bereavement that people sometimes have. But in many cases, really here we are talking, of course, about bereavement of losing someone you love. Excuse me here. Okay. So that's grief. Grief is the distress caused by the state. The thing that happened is the bereavement. You are deprived of someone. That is the thing that happened. The grief is the emotion that you are feeling as a result of that. All right. Then there's mourning. Mourning is not the same as grief. Mourning is how you express that grief. So grief is the distress. Mourning is the expression of that feeling. And bereavement is sort of just the thing, the way that, a fancy way of saying somebody died. But grief is really what we're talking about here. Now, the thing we have to understand about grief is that grief is its own thing. Grief is not depression. Grief is not trauma. Well, okay, actually, excuse me. Grief is a trauma. But it's not. So, grief is something that happens as a result of trauma. So, grief is kind of like PTSD. You have, a person who has a very severe trauma, could have post-traumatic stress disorder. And this can be, obviously, we normally think of PTSD as far as, war, things like that. But if we have a situation where we have another kind of trauma, then we experience something that may not be as severe, where we experience, like, the classic flashbacks, all that kind of thing that you hear about with PTSD, but it is still a way of responding to trauma. And that's what grief is. So grief is to, shall we say, a typical loss. So grief is the response to a typical loss, the way that PTSD is a response to trauma. And now, don't get me wrong, I mean, the loss of someone can very much be a trauma. So we're not really making a real sharp line here. It's kind of an easier shorthand. So think of it as PTSD's close relative. PTSD, on the other hand, expresses itself largely as fear, anxiety. It is a lot harder for people. But grief, if it's not too intermingled, then it is largely yearning, longing. So these are the kinds of things that kind of define the differences. But it is still very... It doesn't hurt to understand that it is, hard that way. But at the same time, I'm talking about how hard it is, but it serves a purpose. And there's a few things that we're trying to do with grief. The first one is this. You want to be able to remember that person and feel the love that you had. I know that it is so hard after you lose somebody to feel that love fully inside of you without feeling that pinch. For me, it's just that little pinch of pain. It's easy to write about that because, the love is the part that you want to remember. I'll skip over that for now. Let's talk more about what the point of grief is. So, first of all, you want to transform your experience of remembering that person from being one where you feel pain to one where you feel the love, where you feel the love that you had for them when they were alive, and that is something that you feel as your primary emotion when you think of them. You're still gonna hurt. We're always gonna want them in our lives again. But that's okay, because part of the process of grief is acceptance. We are accepting the change. We are accepting a new reality. Sometimes a part of grieving, the process, is to change our way of day-to-day living. If they were somebody who was primary in our life, to understand how we can live without them. How we do the things in our lives that they used to help us do, even if it was just, being there if something went wrong. So one of the things is that we have to learn how to accept this, and that's part of the grieving process, is learning the new reality. It is hard, because I know that feeling of, as you begin to accept those changes, you accept that they're gone, and that's really hard. And sometimes it feels like accepting that change is letting them die. It's magical thinking, but I think a lot of us do it. I know I did. I think I still do sometimes. And I think the closer they are to us, the more likely we are to do something like that. I wouldn't say there's anything particularly wrong with doing that here and there. It's just, But that's the thing, is as we get through it, you understand that it's not really a helpful way to be. You can do that a few times, but after a while you have to realize that as much as you try that, they're not coming back. And so that's the thing. It's not you. It's not something that you can do. There's not some magical way that you can make it unhappen. I'm sorry. So it's time to get on with the day-to-day living. The last one is to be able to get through it. When you get through it, when you get through the other side, that pain is gone. It's not gone, but it lives in a different part of you. It isn't right there on top of everything anymore. You get the joy, feel the joyous satisfaction of the things that you do. I know that for me, it's been, oh my God, so many years since I lost my father. 30 years now. And I still occasionally think, yeah, Dad would have liked that. I wish I could have shown him that. And that's okay, because you can still feel that satisfaction in that process. You can return to having a sense of purpose and meaning in your life without truly saying goodbye. Because they're always there. You know that. It's the whole "they're always a part of us" thing. But it's real. We don't just say it because it's a convenient platitude. It happens to be a true one. Lastly, part of the grieving process is that if you're going through it very deeply in the moment, it's hard to see what the future could be like. It's hard to imagine what it's going to end up. But when you go through the grieving process, you can start seeing that future. Now, granted, there are a lot of complications with that. We are particularly in a time where we've got, with the whole pandemic lockdown, it's harder to see what our future would be. But the thing is, it really isn't any worse. When you're going through the grieving process, part of that is understanding that there is a huge change that has happened, a huge change that has to happen in you. And the good news is that, if the world is in flux, hey, there's no better time to be changing. I'm sorry. But you can make it through this. It's really not any worse. So, that's a little bit of time defining some of the things about grief. One of the other things that I want to make clear about grief is that the process itself it's not like an illness. We talk about grief as something that you, or the death of someone is something that you get over. Like you get over the flu, you get over being, So, here's the thing. What you're trying to do is not get over it. Because getting over it implies that maybe you could do something to just get over it quicker, and it'll be faster, and it'll be better, and you'll be all right real soon. But, right, that's not really the way that it works, is it? See, that would be true if it were just a sickness, but grief has a purpose. I talked about that, right? So, what you're trying to do is not just feel better. You're trying to grow through the grief. And that's what grief is. Grief is a process of growing. Grief is a process where you grow larger than the grief itself. So, here's the thing. If you've got all this love for your person that you had that's lost, right? You've got all this love. But now, as I said, grief is the shape that love has when you lose someone. So now this is that love is now grief. It's like this here. So what do? Do you take that and do you smash it down and you make it smaller and smaller and smaller? Is that what you want to do with your love? Is that what you want to do with someone who's gone? Someone who's so much in your world. You want to make them so small? But that's not what you do. No. What you do is you make your world bigger. You see, this was so much of your world. And it's still that size. But you make your world bigger and bigger. So that your heart grows. That part inside of you that you had that held them is still there. But now you've got new experiences, new love, life, and moving on that has made that grow. So, don't fight it. but also don't hold on to it. Let the experience do its work. There's times where it's going to come at you and you're just going to be like, I can't do it. I don't know how to do it, and that's fine. Don't. Let it go for a minute. But when you can, feel it. Now, I'm gonna talk a little bit about this whole stages of grief thing. Now, the first thing that I want to emphasize more than anything else here is that each person has their own path through grief. You can only find yours. That said, we've all heard of the basic 5 stages of grief. Let me pull this up here. Okay. Now, the thing about the 5 stages of grief that I want to say is that this is not a roadmap. This is not the way that it is supposed to be. What this is more than anything else is kind of just an understanding of the form that it can take. This is a form that it often takes, but if it doesn't take this form, that doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It means that there may be a way that you need to experience it, there may be something that's going on, but you can get through it. But let's talk about it. Okay, so for the most part, there's too many words on this picture, but let's start going from left to right. Okay, far left. All right, stage 1 is shock, right? We've all been there. What? So I'm going to talk about Keith for a minute. My friend Keith Pace died recently, about a month ago now. It was not from COVID. I'm going to call it societal complications from COVID, for lack of anything else. Yeah, he had a heart attack while climbing up and down the stairs of a 3-story building doing a ghost tour. And he passed out, and 911 was called, and he should have gone to the hospital. But because of what's going on with COVID and a variety of things, he did not, and he died at his home the next day. I miss him dearly. He was one of truly the finer people I've known here in St. Augustine. So, when I heard that he died, I was like, wait. I mean, I still kind of feel that way a little bit. And then there's denial. Now, denial, of course, the big joke. Denial, it's not just a river in Egypt. But yeah, there's that moment where we just go, no, I'm just not going to think about it. But as long as I don't think about it, it's not happening. It's not real. It's not real. Then there's anger. Why couldn't have my friend just gone to the hospital? Why did this have to happen during the time of COVID-19? Why do we have to be in a state where it's still going on, and at that point in time was going on so hard that it was terrifying? Still is, actually. So, yeah, a lot of things to be angry about on that one. Now, those are the sideways words. I'm going to talk about the catharsis, depression, crisis words here. Time is just saying that the more time goes in that direction, the more time you have, the longer life goes on, the less, or the more further you go along that graph. Okay, so after anger, you have bargaining. And bargaining is the one where you go, oh God, is it really true? I mean, and I think, wow, I wish I'd been scheduled for that night. I wish that I could have done something to make it not happen. Dear God, take me instead of this person I care about. There's a lot of bargaining that one does. One realizes that the bargains don't work. And that's when you accept it. Now, that theoretically is one that's going to help. That's your 5 stages. But you can see here on that little point that has that little arrow on it, right up there. Okay. Says catharsis. Looks like catharsis, but catharsis. Catharsis is, well, it's getting it all out. So this is a little bit about what I was talking about earlier. And about you don't fight it. You let the experience do its work. Because there's times when you're gonna fight it. Because you can't feel it at that time. But there's times when you can. And that's part of your catharsis. That's that time when you cry your eyes out. It's the time when you scream. It's the time when you, maybe, I don't know, it depends. Maybe you write, maybe you make a video, maybe you post a bunch of pictures to Facebook, I don't know. Can be different for every person. But it's a thing where you go through it. You let yourself feel it. Catharsis comes from, I believe it is a medical term. Maybe it's from something older, but it's when you get literally everything out of you. You take a laxative, right? It makes you get rid of some of the stuff in you. You take too much of that stuff, and it's catharsis, and it's all out of you. And so you're trying to get all that crap out of you. And that's a catharsis. And that's why you let the process do its work. That's why you let it happen. So, that's a little bit about how grief can work. It can be hard sometimes to remember that there is a reason why we're doing this. There's a reason why you let yourself feel it. There's a reason why you're going through it. There's a reason why it's happening. It really does all happen for a reason, or at least all of these stages do. I'm not going to tell you that your loved one's death happened for a reason. I hope it did. I hope it's something that you can figure out. But what I can tell you is this process here. The things that you're feeling, they have a reason. They have a good one. Let yourself feel it. You'll get out to the other side. I just want to remind you what is actually on that other side one last time. Going through my notes here. Because sometimes it can be hard to remember. So, here's what we're hoping to do. 1, take that pain that you feel when you think about that person that you love and temper it into a love, perhaps bittersweet memories, but it is still love, so that you can think about them without that pain. Let the grief do its work, and that will happen. Let the grief do its work, and you'll make it through. You'll make it through to the changes that you have to make. Life has changed. I'm sorry. It's hard to accept, but as you do, grief will help you accept these things. Grief will make it easier for you to find the way through. Let it do its work. Lastly, what you're trying to get to a point is where you can feel that joy, all the happiness that you had once again. You're looking for a sense of purpose, which may be lost now. You may find it now. This is one of the things about grief, is that we re-examine so much of this that is truly important to us. That is one of the good things about it. And in that process, we begin to be able to envision a future where you can be happy again, a future where you can have purpose again, a future with joy, and one where your heart still holds them as much as you ever did. But now your heart is bigger because you've grown, and that is what grief will do. It's not fun. It's one of the hardest pieces of work to do in life. But there's a good reason to do it.